The ancient desert wind swept through the narrow, stone-carved streets of Bani Israel. It was the dead of night. Heavy wooden doors were bolted shut against the cold. Oil lamps had long burned down to glowing embers, plunging the tightly packed houses into a deep, suffocating darkness. The bustling, noisy markets of the day were completely empty. There were no witnesses in the streets. There were no eyes watching from the rooftops. There was only the howling wind and the heavy, unsettling silence of a sleeping nation. Somewhere in that blinding darkness, a man was walking alone. He was a man of immense wealth, a figure of status and prominence, whose life was deeply intertwined with the inheritance and power structures of his family. He walked through the shadows, completely unaware that he was taking his final steps on this earth. Then came the strike. Violent, sudden, and completely silent. The wealthy man fell to the dirt. Life entirely left his body. The killer, moving with desperate speed, did not leave the corpse hidden in the shadows or buried beneath the desert sands. In a calculated, sinister move designed to shift the blame, the body was dragged and discarded out in the open, directly between the territories of two massive rival tribes. The killer vanished back into the night, leaving the blood to soak into the earth, confident that the secret was permanently buried. Then, dawn broke. The sun rose over the horizon, casting long, harsh shadows over the dirt streets. The people of Bani Israel began to wake. Doors creaked open, merchants stepped out to begin their day. And there, lying in the open dust where every single eye would inevitably fall upon him, was the lifeless body. A piercing cry shattered the morning quiet. Within minutes, the street was entirely flooded with people. They ran from their homes, pushing past one another, forming a massive, tightly packed circle around the corpse. They stared down at the violent wounds, their faces twisting in horror. But the horror did not last long. Almost instantly, the shock morphed into something far more volatile. Grief ignited into public outrage. The slain man's family pushed through the crowd, falling to their knees in the dirt, weeping bitterly over his cold body. But as they looked up at the faces of the people surrounding them, their sorrow hardened into pure, blinding fury. Who had done this? Why was he dumped here? Because the body had been strategically placed between the neighborhoods of different tribes, the accusations began immediately. Men who had been neighbors just hours before now looked at each other with venomous suspicion. Voices rose above the weeping. Fingers were pointed. "You killed him," one group shouted, advancing forward. "You brought him here to frame us," the other side roared back, their faces red with rage. The air grew dangerously thick. The matter was no longer a simple tragedy between one mourning household and a hidden killer. It was spreading like wildfire, threatening to consume the entire society. The tribalism of the ancient world was a terrifying force. When blood was spilled, logic vanished. Generational grudges, old jealousies, and buried rivalries were violently pulled back to the surface. Young men began to step back from the crowd, their hands instinctively gripping the hilts of their swords. The distinct, metallic sound of blades being drawn echoed in the narrow street. Shields were brought out. Each side aggressively denied the crime. Each side swore absolute innocence, while fiercely preparing to slaughter the other to defend their honor. No one had a shred of proof. No witness came forward from the shadows. No confession broke the agonizing tension. There was only blind anger, and blind anger always demands blood. Bani Israel could physically feel the terrifying edge of the cliff they were standing on. One more spark, one wrong word, one miscalculated push in that crowded street, and the entire nation would completely collapse into a catastrophic civil war. Hundreds of men were about to die over a secret they could not uncover. Realizing that human logic had entirely failed them, and staring down the barrel of their own destruction, the elders of the tribes forced the young men to lower their weapons. They needed an answer that no tribe could argue with, a truth that would not bend under the weight of human emotion, pride, or revenge. They turned to the only man whose authority could not be challenged. The crowds marched through the dust, carrying the heavy, suffocating tension of the murder with them, until they stood before Musa, peace be upon him. They stood before the mighty prophet of Allah, completely cornered by their own confusion. They demanded a name. They wanted absolute certainty. They wanted Musa to use his connection to the heavens to simply point a finger at the guilty man so they could execute him and be done with it. They wanted the divine revelation to perfectly serve their human anger. Musa looked at the divided, furious nation. The matter was far too heavy for human guesswork and far too dangerous for emotional reactions. He turned away from their shouting and sought the guidance of Allah, the knower of the unseen, the one from whom no secret in the heavens or the earth is ever hidden. If the people of Bani Israel had truly, sincerely wanted the truth, they would have stood in absolute silence. They would have prepared their hearts to completely and unconditionally submit to whatever command came down from the heavens. But when the divine answer finally arrived, it shattered every single expectation they had. It did not look anything like the human justice they had imagined in their minds. Musa turned back to face the massive, waiting crowd. The tribes held their breath, waiting for a name, waiting for a specific family to be condemned. Instead, Musa stood with towering prophetic dignity and said, "Indeed, Allah commands you to slaughter a cow." For a moment, the air must have felt incredibly strange. The silence was absolute. A cow? The people stared at him, completely bewildered. They had brought him a bleeding corpse. They had brought him a society on the very brink of a horrific civil war. They were demanding a murder investigation. And the command from the Lord of the heavens was to take a knife and slaughter a cow. Their minds could not hold it. They were looking for something immediate, something that perfectly fit into the narrow, tight limits of their own human reasoning. But revelation does not bend itself to accommodate people's assumptions. Allah does not need to explain his infinite, flawless wisdom to his creation before he expects to be obeyed. The test was never really about the animal. The test was about the state of their hearts. Would they submit first and trust that the Creator's wisdom would unfold? Or would they arrogantly make their own limited minds the supreme judge over what Allah had just commanded? Instead of hurrying to obey the Prophet of God, they physically stepped back. Dark suspicion entered their eyes. Arrogant resistance rose to the surface of their words. They looked at Musa, the very prophet who had stood before the tyrant Pharaoh, the man who had struck the sea with his staff and split the ocean in half to save their lives, and they dared to say, "Are you taking us in ridicule?" That one deeply disrespectful sentence exposed exactly how far a human heart can violently drift when it loses its reverence for prophecy. They were treating Musa like a man making jokes in a marketplace. They were responding to divine instruction as though it had to first pass through the filter of their own personal approval before it deserved to be taken seriously. Musa did not flinch. He did not argue with their disrespect. He answered them with the crystal clarity of a man who truly knows the majesty of his Lord. "I seek refuge in Allah from being among the ignorant." He shut the door on their accusation instantly. Mockery is the tool of the ignorant. Playing games with the ultimate truth is the behavior of fools. He was conveying the direct, unalterable command of the Creator of the universe, and the Creator does not play games with his creation. Classical exegetes, deeply reflecting on this moment, note a profound and tragic reality. If Bani Israel had simply walked over to the very first cow they saw grazing in the field, tied it down, and slaughtered it in the name of Allah, the command would have been completely fulfilled. The matter would have moved forward instantly. The ease of the religion was standing right in front of them, but true obedience was too heavy for their massive egos to bear. Questions buy time. Questions create a comfortable, philosophical distance from the reality of physical action. Questions make a hesitant, stubborn heart feel incredibly intellectual and serious, while it quietly and deceptively avoids the direct command standing right in front of it. So instead of drawing a knife, they drew out the argument. They demanded, "Ask your Lord to make clear to us what it is." They wanted the matter stretched. They wanted more detail. A second answer came down from the heavens. Musa told them, he says, "It is a cow, which is neither old nor virgin, but median between that." It was a perfectly balanced description. Not too old and frail, not too young and small, somewhere right in the middle. It was ordinary enough that they could have found thousands of them by simply walking through the pastures. Musa even added an explicit, urgent warning to the end of the message. So, do what you are commanded. Stop talking, stop analyzing, move your feet and obey, but they still refused to move. Their hearts were not at peace with submission. They pushed the boundaries again, tightening the invisible noose around their own necks. "Ask your Lord to make clear to us what is its color." Another answer came down. The divine net grew smaller. Musa replied. He says, "It is a yellow cow, bright in color, pleasing to the observers." The image was suddenly much sharper. It was no longer just any ordinary cow. It had to be a distinct, radiant yellow, the kind of animal that instantly catches the eye before anyone even has to ask why. The broad, forgiving path of ease had begun to severely narrow. Still, incredibly, they did not move. They had more than enough information to begin the search, but when a heart resists guidance, even the brightest signs begin to feel blurred. Their arrogance convinced them that they were being careful, when in reality, they were just being disobedient. They pushed the boundary one final, dangerous time. "Ask your Lord to make clear to us what it is, for all cows look alike to us, and indeed we, if Allah wills, will be guided." The final, crushing answer came down, locking them entirely inside the prison of their own making. Musa delivered the final conditions. He says, "It is a cow neither trained to plow the earth nor to irrigate the field, one free from fault with no spot upon her." Now, the matter had become unimaginably specific. Not old, not young, bright, radiant yellow, not worn down by a single day of human labor, never used to turn the heavy soil, never used to pull water from the wells. Absolutely sound, completely whole, without even a single hair of another color breaking its pure, immaculate hide. The easy choices had completely vanished into thin air. Their own stubbornness had turned a simple 5-minute task into an excruciating, almost impossible human strain. Men spread out frantically across the blazing desert. They marched through the dust, going desperately from farm to farm, market to market, looking into enclosures, studying herds, bargaining, comparing, rejecting. The search was agonizing. Every single time they thought they had found it, some tiny detail ruined the match. One farmer brought forward a magnificent yellow cow, but under questioning, admitted it had once been used to plow a small patch of land. Rejected. Another presented a strong, completely unworked animal, but upon close inspection, a tiny black mark was found hidden near its hoof, breaking the purity of its hide. Rejected. The heat of the sun beat down on them. The days dragged on. The absolute frustration of an entire nation boiled over into exhaustion. Each failed search was a brutal, undeniable physical reminder that they had built this trap themselves. No enemy had done this to them. No oppressor had forced this labor upon them. They had taken a merciful, wide-open command that could have been met with quick, easy obedience and twisted it into an unbearable burden. Then, at last, after exhausting themselves entirely, they found it. Standing apart from a herd, as though it had been waiting for this exact moment all along, was the perfect animal. Its color was striking, bright, and pure. There was absolutely no sign of wear on its body, no trace of grueling labor. Not a single microscopic flaw broke the divine description. It was the one single animal on the face of the earth that fit exactly what Allah had commanded. But the trial was still not over. The cow belonged to someone else, and because it was the only one of its kind that fit the impossibly narrow description they themselves had demanded, the price was exorbitant. Shock moved through the ranks of Bani Israel. Faces tightened, voices dropped in despair. They had already paid for this command with wasted time, massive stress, and deep public humiliation. Now they would have to pool their wealth and pay a staggering, almost unthinkable amount of money to acquire it. Obedience had once been beautifully simple and entirely free. Now it was devastatingly costly. Allah perfectly captures the heavy, lingering reluctance in their chests in the Qur'an. So they slaughtered her, but they could hardly do it. Even at the very end, as they handed over the massive wealth and drew the blade, their hearts were still dragging heavily behind their bodies. The rare animal fell. Its blood spilled into the earth. Its life ended. They had finally, begrudgingly, painfully done what they should have done from the very first minute. But the slain man was still lying there, silent, cold, completely motionless. The killer remained perfectly hidden, still protected by the terrifying silence of the dead. Then Allah gave the final, chilling command. Musa told the people to step forward, take a piece of the freshly slaughtered cow, and violently strike the dead body with it. No long philosophical explanation accompanied the order. No dramatic speech. No gradual warning of what was about to happen. Just a raw, direct command from the Supreme Lord who alone gives life and who alone takes it away. The loud, arrogant noise that had followed this murder case from the beginning was instantly gone. The entire nation stood in breathless, suffocating silence. Every single eye in the vast crowd was glued to the cold, decaying body lying in the dirt. No one had an argument now. No one dared to raise another technical question. This was no longer the place for human debate. This was the place where divine revelation was about to speak in a language no human being could ever imitate. A man stepped forward, holding a piece of the slaughtered animal. He raised his arm, and with a heavy thud, he struck the lifeless corpse. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then, the impossible occurred. The body moved. Not with the weak, shifting weight of a falling limb, not with the illusion of fearful, exhausted eyes playing tricks in the harsh sunlight. It moved with actual, terrifying, undeniable life. By the absolute, supreme permission of Allah, the dead man rose. The cold, heavy stillness of death was violently broken. The chest that had been perfectly still suddenly heaved with breath. Color rushed furiously back into the pale, ashen face where lifelessness had settled for days. The eyes snapped open. The mouth that had been permanently sealed by the finality of death was forced open by the sheer will of the one who created human speech in the first place. The man who had been murdered stood up. A wave of absolute terror swept through the crowd. Men stumbled backward, their faces drained of blood. Before the utterly paralyzed people around him could fully comprehend what their minds were witnessing, the truth they had completely failed to reach through their suspicion, their tribalism, and their endless arguments came out in a single, devastating action. The dead man raised his hand. He pointed directly at his killer in the crowd. He spoke the name. The voice echoed in the absolute silence, ringing with a terrifying clarity. It was not a rumor. It was not tribal guesswork. It was not a forced confession under the threat of a sword. The undeniable truth was delivered by the victim himself, pulled back from the other side of the grave by the command of the Almighty. In that single, breathtaking moment, the carefully hidden truth completely collapsed into the open. The murderer was entirely unmasked, frozen in terror as the finger of the man he had killed pointed directly at his chest. No tribe could twist the story to save their honor now. No wealthy family could bury the crime beneath noise, bribery, and outrage. Allah had forcefully brought the truth out into the blinding light through a sign so deeply overwhelming, so completely terrifying, that no one standing there could ever possibly deny it. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the moment passed. The divine permission lifted, the life instantly drained from the man's eyes. He collapsed back into the dirt. He returned to death once more, completely silent, completely still. He had not come back to resume his worldly life. He had not risen to walk among them, eat with them, or return to his wealth. He rose only long enough for divine justice to breathe. It was a monumental, earth-shattering sign, a sign that Allah alone brings life from death. A sign that absolutely nothing buried in the earth, no matter how deep, remains hidden when the Creator wills it to be exposed. The exact same Lord who will inevitably resurrect all of humanity from their graves on the last day had just shown Bani Israel with their own physical eyes that even death itself bows to his command. The killer was permanently exposed. The tribal dispute was settled without a single drop of civil war blood being spilled. The ultimate miracle had happened. You would think the story ends there. You would imagine an entire nation falling to their knees in the dust, weeping in profound repentance, their hearts completely and permanently transformed by the sheer, terrifying majesty of what they had just seen. But the Qur'an does not end the story with celebration. Instead, it turns the camera away from the dead man and points it directly at something far more unsettling. In the very next verse, Allah reveals the devastating psychological aftermath of the miracle. Then your hearts became hardened after that, being like stones, or even harder. That is the ultimate, timeless warning woven into the fabric of this event. Not every eye that sees a miracle truly learns from it. Not every person who witnesses the extraordinary becomes humble. Some people can stand directly in front of the ultimate truth, watch it blaze as brightly as the sun, and still something deep, dark, and diseased inside of their chests absolutely refuses to bend. The dead man had spoken. What greater, more undeniable proof could human beings possibly ask for? What stronger, more terrifying sign could a nation demand after all their endless questions, all their arrogant suspicion, all their agonizing delays? Allah had literally torn open the unbreachable veil between life and death for a brief moment, letting them witness a reality that no human power, no king, and no army could ever produce. And yet, their hearts remained as hard as rock. Allah tells us that even the stones beneath our feet are softer than a diseased, arrogant heart. A stone can physically split, and pure rivers can flow from it. A stone can crack and release water by the command of Allah. A massive boulder can fall down from a mountain in absolute awe and fear of its Lord. But a human heart that grows entirely used to argument, pride, arrogance, and resistance, that heart can become harder than the very rocks themselves. The story of the cow is not just a historical recount of a murder from thousands of years ago. It is a profound, living warning about what happens when people constantly push back against divine guidance until their souls permanently lose the ability to respond. First came a simple command, then came a delay, then came unnecessary philosophical questions, then came more strict conditions, then came an unbelievable miracle. And even after all of that, the disease of arrogance inside them remained entirely uncured. How often does the absolute truth come to a person clearly, yet they keep asking questions not because they genuinely want guidance, but because they simply do not want to submit? How often does someone deliberately complicate what Allah made beautifully simple, only to complain when the path of religion suddenly feels too narrow and suffocating? Bani Israel was shown that Allah gives life to the dead. They were shown that truth can literally rise from a decaying corpse and expose what the living desperately tried to hide. Do not let endless questions and philosophical debates become a shield against simple obedience. Do not stand before the clear, undeniable signs of Allah and remain entirely unchanged. Because the most frightening part of this entire story was never the brutal murder in the night. It was that the dead spoke, and many of the living still refused to wake up. If this deep dive into the hidden depths of Islamic history moved your heart, please drop a like and subscribe to Iman AlDeen TV. It is our absolute duty to pass the clarity of this deen to the next generation. Share this video with your family and friends, and join us next time as we continue bringing the timeless truths of the Qur'an to life. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.